When I moved to Seattle over a decade ago, I didn't know exactly what I was going to do with my life, but I did know that I wanted to find a way to make my living doing something creative. In particular, I loved movies and I loved film, and I wanted to find some way to be involved in productions, whether on screen or behind the camera. So I went for every audition and every gig I could get, but the opportunities here in Seattle were always pretty few and far between. I've always been kind of surprised that there weren't more film projects happening in Seattle. And as it turns out, there's actually a few reasons for that. And the city of Seattle has actually been working quietly behind the scenes to address some of these problems. Specifically, King County recently invested in repurposing some old warehouses and turning them into film studios, providing for the first time a place where major productions can shoot within the city. And the state of Washington also recently changed up the tax incentives to make our area more competitive as a shooting location. I wanted to learn more about the big changes that are happening to Seattle's film industry, so I reached out to today's guest, Kate Becker, who is the Creative Economic Director for King County. Kate was the co-founder of Seattle's beloved music venue, the Vera Project, and now she's a major player in the city's push to attract filmmakers. So she seemed like the perfect person I could talk to learn more about what the future of filmmaking will look like in Seattle, and also to get some insight into how city officials approach creativity at large and what they're doing to create new opportunities for emerging artists. With all that in mind, I hope you enjoy this conversation between me and the Creative Economic Director of King County, Kate Becker.
You probably are a super pro at this, so this is probably a dumb question. But you know that egg carton stuff that people use when they build like band rehearsal rooms,
Yeah,
that kind of thing. It really deadens sound.
Totally. I plan to do some of that once I have the resources.
Got it.
Basically, it's on my list. I also plan to get some arms for the mics so that I can have them closer to our mouths and have the levels lower.
Nice.
Um,
Should I tilt this towards me?
so the sound's the
Okay.
front part. So you
All right.
don't want the top, you want the front kind of
Okay.
at you. But as long as it's like that, we should be okay.
All right.
All right. So we are rolling.
Oh, we are rolling.
We're rolling
Oh,
already.
okay.
Yep. So we're just gonna jump right into it here.
Okay.
First of all, Kate, thank you so much for joining me here and talking to me today.
Thanks for being so persistent, Zach.
It's-
I'm happy
that's
to
what I
be
do.
here. Yeah.
So basically, I came across you when I was reading about basically the changes that are undergoing in like the Seattle filmmaking world right now. And first of all, I was interested in that. I love making videos and would like to do more filmmaking myself. So I was interested from that perspective. But also, I was just like, I saw your name and position list, and I was like, what is it like to be a creative economic director for a city? Because I feel like there's a big kind of gap between, for a lot of the times, between creatives and more like, I guess, administrative type roles. And
For
so
sure.
I wanted to talk to somebody who had kind of like a foot in each world. So to get started, could you just tell me a little bit about yourself and how you ended up where you are today in terms of handling this role?
Sure. So I co-founded, excuse me, Zach, I hope you can edit. I co-founded the Vera Project a little over 20 years ago. And we just had our big celebration on Saturday night to celebrate our 20 years of the Vera Project, actually. But leading up to that, we had a silly footloose law on the books in Seattle called the Teen Dance Ordinance. And I was very involved in organizing and activism and testifying in front of city council and trying to get folks to repeal this law. And somewhere along the line, someone must have thought that I was a reasonable person or something, because they later appointed me to work at the city. But in between, I worked at the Vera Project, and then I worked at Seattle Theater Group, which is the Paramount, Moore, and Neptune theaters and all the associated education and cultural programs. And so I did that for a little over 5 years. And then I went to work at the city of Seattle Initially on cannabis legislation and nightlife policy, and then I was appointed to run the Office of Film and Music, which I did for 5 years. And then Executive Constantine, who is a huge film and music champion and is now my current boss, recruited me to come work for the county and launch the first creative economy initiative. So, combination of boots on the ground work, like doing the work, producing shows, activism, and political, I don't know, connection, political relationship, something like that.
I think that's also interesting. I want to try to get into all of it with you here. But let's start with the Vera Project,
Yeah.
which I love myself. I've been to a few shows there over the years
Nice.
and had great times. How did that idea come into fruition when you were, let's go way back 20 years ago when you first
Okay.
were like approaching the idea of making the Vera Project happen? How did that go from an idea to a reality?
Great, great question. So I was very active in the teen dance ordinance activism because I knew young people should have a right to have access to music and dancing, and that it was all not nearly as scary as some people seem to think it was, and that we needed to change the law. So I was lobbying the Seattle Arts Commission to get on board with repealing the teen dance ordinance. And there were two people sitting on the sidelines who looked super excited about what I was saying. And that was my co-founding partners in the Vera Project, Shannon Stort and James Keblis, who were college students at the time. And they went on to go to Groningen, Holland, and study Vera there, which is a venue, amazing venue, supported by the Dutch government for more than 120 years now. And many, many bands who pass through the Netherlands stop at Vera. And so that was part of the inspiration. And together we just buckled down. And I had been producing shows for a long time in Seattle before that. And so some of them illegally because the law was wrong. And so we got busy together starting the Vera Project, and really just rallied young people to support it and people who believed in music and access to music to support it. And we were very grassroots and very DIY in the beginning. We had a union hall at First and Broad that we would show up at every Saturday night and convert it to break down hundreds of chairs, move in a sound system, convert it into a venue, have a show, and then break down all the chairs afterwards, or set all the chairs back up and break down the sound system afterwards. And we did that for a year. And then we moved to the ID and had a venue there for a year. And then we moved to 4th and Virginia for 3 years. And finally, we built the long-lasting Vera Project at Seattle Center.
Wow, it's so freaking cool, and it's so important to have a space. Like, space is such a huge thing, just giving people access. When it came to getting the actual physical space, were you working with the city to make that happen, or was it just like you privately like started renting a space? And did you fundraise to get the funds to start that, or like where did the financial aspect of that come in?
Yes, yes, and yes. Yes, we were privately renting the space. Yes, we were fundraising to pay for the space. And yes, the city was one of our early funders went to fund the Vera Project initiative. So we did get some funding from the city early on. And then when we moved to Seattle Center, they were good partners in negotiating a long-standing lease there.
That's awesome. And how has the Vera Project managed to stay around for so long too, when it seems like a lot of other places have come and gone in the same amount of time in Seattle, but they've kept going, and they're even through the pandemic, they're up and running again, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Vera has great leadership and great young people involved with it. And that's one of the things we were celebrating Saturday night at the 20-year party, is that lots of all ages venues come and go, and they tend to often be led by college students. And then when the college student graduates or leaves that town, the all ages space falls apart. And so there aren't a lot of long lasting all ages venues. And Vera is certainly one of them. And it's because people love it and they keep coming, and because the programming is really responsive to what young people want. That is the goal. It's not supposed to be decided by adults who think they know best. It is supposed to be decided by today's young people as to what they want that venue to be, and then it's the adults' job to try to assist in making that happen.
So let's get into your work with King County a little bit. And you first got tapped in for that on an earlier position before this, before like the creative the current like creative economic plan that you guys are working on?
Well, I was hired to launch the county's first creative economy initiative in 2019. But by February of 2020, we were all headed into a pandemic. So my position title changed to be Creative Economy and Recovery Director because the live music scene, the performing arts venues, the places that bring large groups of people together as their business model, we knew they were in grave danger from the moment the pandemic started. And so really focusing on recovery, meeting with those folks regularly, figuring out strategies with them as to when to close their doors, how to lay off their staff, where there might be recovery funding, because there wasn't a lot right in the beginning. King County, I'm happy to say, was the first government in the country to put public funding forward to try to preserve live music venues, independent live music venues. And so I work with music venues, I work with arts and culture producers, I work with lots of folks, festival and event producers. They were really in trouble too. Lots of events and festivals canceled throughout the years, and still this year, not solidly back yet. And so really focusing on how to navigate a pandemic, which was uncharted waters for all of us. So we just had to figure out together what were the survival strategies for folks to stay in business. And I'm happy to say most of them have stayed in business, but they're not back to 100% yet at all by any means.
So what sort of things, before we get into how the pandemic changed the plan, what sort of things were the initial goals of the plan before everything took a left
Great
turn?
question, Zach. So we had a little under a year to do that, and we launched our film initiative in September of 2019. We went out to a very famous Twin Peaks location out in North Bend, known as the Double R Diner in Twin Peaks, and with a bunch of film professionals, and announced that we were handling permitting differently in King County. And film permitting is a big deal. You know, when folks are filming, they need a permit, and it has to all be coordinated. If you're closing down streets, or you need police officers on site because you have weapons in your film, or you are using a park and it's impeding upon the public access, all that has to be coordinated. So better, faster permitting, reduced permitting fees, and prioritizing King County real estate and buildings for film production, which has been really great. So we launched that, and then in February of 2019, middle of the month, we were at Washington Hall with about 160 music folks, launching our music initiative, and 2 weeks later, it was all starting to fall apart around us because we knew that we weren't going to be able to move forward on a lot of the things we wanted to move forward on because the pandemic was becoming a reality. But during the pandemic, we launched a film production facility, Harbor Island Studios. And so happy to talk with you about that as we go.
Yeah, I did want to ask about that. So why don't you just introduce the concept, first of all, because I've read about it, but why don't you, for people who haven't heard about it at all, tell me about that.
Okay. So amazing as it is, Seattle and King County have not had a proper film production facility ever, really, of a major scale. The closest thing to this was a soundstage in Redmond that wrapped up when Northern Exposure wrapped in 1995. I don't even know if you were alive, Zach, when Northern Exposure wrapped. And so there hasn't been a major film production facility here since that time. And so when folks are making films and they need a soundstage, they need to be able to control the sound, they need to be able to build big sets, they need gigantic space to work in. There hasn't been anything here for them. And so King County had a warehouse down on Harbor Island, 117,000 square foot warehouse with very high ceilings. And as soon as we saw it, I thought, I can think of a better and higher use for this building. And so we got busy working on that. The executive put his political shoulder behind it, saying, okay, we're going to do this. And it was part of our recovery strategy during COVID to put filmmakers back to work, but they had to have controlled space. They had to be able to socially distance. They had to be able to keep different groups of people separated from different groups of people in the pre-vaccine days, when it was still a very scary time in the pandemic. And Amy Poehler had an episodic production that we had worked with in its first season earlier in 2019. And so they needed a production facility, and we were able to land their second season. And they put a few hundred people back to work during the pandemic for months on end in Harbor Island Studios. So it was a bit of a miracle that my colleagues in King County were able to remodel a warehouse into a functional film production space while simultaneously having to set up all the isolation and quarantine spaces around the county and all the public health response that was required in that time. So really proud of my colleagues for pulling that off, and for that production, for making it work, to put few hundred people back to work in the pandemic who are unemployed film professionals was really important.
Yeah. Well, that's always been something was so surprising to me. I moved up here about 10 years ago, and it was always a shock to me that there wasn't more film stuff going on, because Seattle is such a beautiful and like cinematic city, you'd think, and there's so many creative people here that want to do more filmmaking or want to do more acting. And so it was like, what was the missing thing? And hearing this, like, a lot of it was space. It's that same thing of just needing a space to actually be able to make the creation. So I think that's super fascinating. Are there more projects beyond the Amy Poehler one that are moving into that space now that it's there?
Yes, we had a reality TV show in there recently. We had 5 weeks. I think I'm allowed to talk about it now because they've come and gone. 5 weeks of Love is Blind was in there. And we are doing a few other pilot projects as we're making some additional improvements now and heading towards a grand opening. So you will hear about a grand opening moment when we invite the full community to come to Harbor Island Studios. But, it was a warehouse, and now it's a sound stage, or somewhere close to a sound stage. We're still finishing some of the final sound mitigation issues. There have been some issues, which are no secret to the film industry, like seagulls. Seagulls are loud as hell, right? And so we had to figure out, how do we get the seagulls, which are protected migratory birds, so there's very little you can do to them. What can we do to keep them off the roof? Because they're squawking like crazy on the roof, and they were interrupting takes. And so we have the seagulls safely not coming on the roof anymore. I'm happy to say that. And working on some final things of fixing up some offices and some sound mitigation issues, and then we will reopen. But there has been a lot of demand for Harbor Island Studios without us ever marketing it. So it's sheerly word of mouth right now that is drawing attention to this.
Wow. Out of curiosity, what ended up being the solution to the seagulls?
Oh, really? You want to know?
I'm
Because it's
curious.
wild. It's a magic gel. I'm not kidding. It's a magic gel that when a seagull looks at it, it looks like fire.
Huh.
And if the seagull is bold enough to go in there and peck the gel that looks like fire, they'll get hit with cayenne pepper that will not hurt them or kill them, but it will convince them never to come back to that place.
Clever.
Who knew? Who knew? Yes, but yeah. I did want to say one other thing, Zach. The other piece of why we don't have big film in Seattle historically has been because we've chosen not to have a competitive incentive until this year.
Mm-hmm.
So
that was the other thing that they talked about in the article, where these two, the space and the tax incentives. So what are they doing in terms of the incentives? What's that actually look like?
So for many years, we have had a $3.5 million incentive statewide. For comparison, Oregon has 16, Montana has 12, BC has a ridiculous number that is really, really high and seems to have no cap on it. So that was our competition surrounding us, right? And we just weren't competitive, because if you are a filmmaker and say you're making a big film, let's say a $10 million film, and you come and you talk to us here in Seattle and King County, and we say, oh, well, we'll hook you up with some production offices and some accessible spaces, and we'll make permitting easy, and we'll do everything we can to make sure you have a really good time here. And then you go to Oregon or Montana and they say, yeah, we'll do that, and we'll give you 35 cents back on every dollar that you spend here. Well, what's the producer going to do, right? It's going to cost them a third less to produce in a different state. So we weren't keeping up our competitive edge. And I am happy to say, after years of activism and advocacy, film industry really pulling together, led by Washington Film Works, the state film agency, we now have a $15 million incentive for the first time in Washington's history. So we are super excited about where the film industry is going to go now. Between the incentive and Harbor Island Studios holds tremendous potential.
Wow. So when it comes to like figuring out the like state budget for this kind of stuff, like is that something that you're involved with? Like, do you have to fight for your part of the budget, or do they just give you like a certain budget and they say this is what we're using for our creative part of the, sector, like figure out how to use it wisely? Like how's that worked out?
It's a really astute question. Depends on the year and how much funding is available and how flexible it is. But yes, there's always a jockeying of everyone's priorities. And then ultimately, the executive and the budget director have to make the decision about who gets funded. That's how it works at a local level. At a state level, I think it works similarly. All the different legislators champion their issues, the things they think are most important to fund, and they have to try to convince their colleagues to support that, while their colleagues also have other priorities. And so yeah, it is a balancing act, and I've never seen a local government or a state government have so much funding that didn't happen, right? That's always a part of the process. You have to be pitching your case and your funding needs and trying to get traction around that.
When it comes to like the new filmmaking jobs that are being created, where are people finding out about those?
Well, we're all still at a very beginning point. That's a great question. But the state incentive just got approved. So the state office, Washington Filmworks, is building out their plans right now for the state. And we're getting ready for the grand opening of Harbor Island Studios. So those two things will come together nicely and create much opportunity. But really, folks find out through the unions. A lot of the film industry jobs are unionized jobs. When we talk about film jobs, sometimes people think the sexy job is the director job or the filmmaker job. But when we talk about film professional jobs, we are talking about carpenters and electricians and lighting technicians and makeup artists and costume designers and all the folks who are the behind the scenes production folks who make film possible. That's who we're trying to keep employed.
Yeah. Well, I'm just curious for like those people who are listening but maybe just don't know where to get started. Like, is Harbor Island gonna like have a section on their website for like job listings, or if they are like a costume maker and they're like, this sounds awesome, how do I get involved? Is there a place that they can go to look to try to get their foot in the door?
I would refer them to a couple of different places. Our website, the King County Creative website, kingcountycreative.com, which has a couple of pages on there about Harbor Island Studios. Washington Filmworks, washingtonfilmworks.org is where you will find a lot of information, and there's a crew base on there. So folks can put themselves into a crew database saying, these are my skills and I'm looking to be hired. If they're just coming into the industry, there's some production assistant opportunities that allow folks to really get their first training and their first role, their first foot in the door to work in the industry. And then the unions are always welcoming folks to connect with them around film industry jobs.
That's great information for people to have.
Great.
Here's kind of a hypothetical one. If budgets weren't an issue, if you had unlimited funding, what do you think would be the optimal way for government to help creatives?
Oh, this is such a good question. So, this is a very expensive part of the country to live in. So if you are rolling the dice to be a creative, say you want to be a musician, or you want to be a filmmaker, or you want to be a dancer, this is a hard market to do that in. And while we'll never be a society like Europe, where they really underwrite their arts in a different way than we do here in America, they value the arts, even in Canada, they value the arts in a way that collectively we do not in this country. So if budgets weren't a reality, that's what we would do. We would treat those folks who have those dreams to be those things, the dancer, the filmmaker, the musician, like this is a real career, and we want to make sure you're successful at that. So we would make sure those opportunities, those educational opportunities, those performance opportunities, those filmmaking opportunities were funded properly so that they existed for folks to do that, and they didn't have to work so hard to pay the rent.
So one of the things that occurs to me when I think about like all that could encompass like the creative economy in Seattle is like there's like the big scale stuff like an Amy Poehler production, and then there's like all the small scale stuff. There's like street performers, and there's like people who are trying to get their start in their basement, but haven't figured out, don't have all the tools to do so. And so for that, like accessibility seems like the biggest thing. Would you be involved in like, I'm not sure if this is a separate thing or something you'd be involved in, but I'm thinking of like, I know some libraries are like actively like adding like recording studios and like that type of equipment into there. Is that something that you would be like part of that discussion? Is that under the realm of, or is
If
that
I
like
could,
library
absolutely,
kind of
yes.
thing?
Do you know Bellevue has a recording studio in their library? They do. So,
I have, and when I heard that, I'm like, why doesn't every library have that?
right.
And
Yes.
so how do we get that to happen? I guess is the question. Like, how do we get those things that really seem like they make it accessible for anyone? How do we get more of that stuff going? Any
Right.
advice on that?
Well, making your opinion known, make sure your political leaders are hearing from you that you think this is important. This is what we need to help grow our creative economy. But accessibility is huge, especially in an expensive market, right? Where folks don't have extra money to, say, set up a podcasting studio, right? You have done it here, but you've pulled together all the different pieces to make it work, but I'm sure it wasn't particularly easy. And, having that accessible to people, if they could just pop into the library and do the podcast, you wouldn't have to have this set up here, right? So your point about accessibility is huge because when you think about folks who haven't had equitable opportunity, then it's even a further reach to how do you figure out how to make something happen, how to make your dreams come alive, how to have the career you want. And government should be helping to make those opportunities available to people. That is my belief.
Yeah, I agree. It seems like Seattle and a lot of big cities like Seattle, but Seattle specifically is kind of struggling with I guess, like keeping the artists here in that way. Like you said, it's a tough place to be an artist. I read recently, and I haven't double checked this, but I read that like tech workers in Seattle make above the national average for tech workers, but art workers in Seattle make less than the national average for art workers. So it's a tough place to get that by. And there's kind of this ongoing discussion about like, the culture being pushed out of Seattle with gentrification, that sort of stuff. So I guess how do you look at that problem, and how do we work to keep the arts thriving here in the city?
Well, Zach, if you know the answer to that question, I am listening because it's something we're all trying to figure out is how do we anchor our artists, make sure they can stay here and do their work simultaneously with the cost of living. It's a super, super challenge. The way this city and this region have changed over the last 20 plus years is fairly radical change. And lots of our artists, as you mentioned, have been displaced or they're living way outside of the city because rent is more affordable in a more rural area in the suburbs. Some of the suburbs, it's more affordable. And so, there's no good answer to the question. I wish there was. One of the things that is happening that I think is really, really great, and I've had a teeny tiny hand in this, but some folks have done some mighty work with an organization called the Cultural Space Agency. And they are currently acquiring important cultural spaces for community, and then community buys them back from this organization. It is the coolest. So they recently acquired, the Cultural Space Agency recently acquired Soto Hall, then they acquired the Columbia City Theater in Columbia City, and then they're on to Northwest Tap Connection and Cultural Union Cultural Space. Anyhow, all these places are being acquired and then sold back to the community that is right there, so that there is a theater that is accessible for folks in Columbia City, so that Northwest Tap Connection does remain accessible to folks who want to learn to tap dance. Those kind of things. That's a pretty great thing. That's still not answering the living question, right? We need to figure out artist housing and figure out how we do that in a way that is really that works. There's a complex of artist housing with rent controlled housing down at First and Cherry called Good Arts. It's an excellent example of how we keep artists in our city, and that is privately held by a man who just believes we need our artists in our city. And so it's a rent controlled space for artists. We need more of that.
Yeah. Let's talk. You touched on this a little bit earlier, but I'd be curious to hear more about what steps is King County taking to try to help bring the life back into the arts and culture after COVID? Because everyone took such a big hit. We're all trying to get back on track. So, what are the things that are being done, steps being taken?
Great. We're getting ready to open Harbor Island Studios. Right now, we are really focused, mostly due to capacity. We are really keenly focused on film and music production at the heart of our creative economy initiative. So, getting Harbor Island Studios open, helping our venues stay in business. We're doing a big campaign in November in partnership with Visit Seattle, really focused on tourism and music and getting people to come back to Seattle for music. And that also helps musicians, helps put money into musicians' pockets, and it helps our venues keep their profile and keep people coming. And we're a great city for music. And so we are doing that later this fall. We have been really caught up in administering a lot of funding. The executive and King County Council passed $25 million in funding as recovery funding for the arts. So that has been a giant process to administer that to arts and culture organizations, to independent live music venues, independent movie theaters, science organizations, and festival and event producers. That's who we focused our funding on, to really bring them all back, because they were so hard hit because their business model relies on large crowds.
Yeah. Let's see. I'm curious when it comes to like kind of this like repurposing of the old storage,
Right,
units.
the flour mill.
The flour mill, yeah. It makes me think of like so many of the other spaces in Seattle that feel like they aren't living up to their potential in terms of empty spaces, or like one that comes to mind is like the Seattle Underground Comedy Club in Pioneer Square.
Oh yeah.
It was a great space. It's been a few years since it shut down. So if people in the community were like, hey, we want to get this space going again, but we as individuals, I can't afford to open it, but I'd love to see it open. How do we communicate that to the city, or like, can the city help out with that? How do you get a project like that started? Which seems kind of similar to what you did to some degree with the Vera Project, and some degree with this film studio too. So it kind of seems like something maybe you'd have some knowledge on.
Well, I think if you could find a couple of people who were hell-bent and determined to make that happen, right? Who were really willing to like open all the doors, knock on private sector doors, knock on the neighbors' doors. Who wants this space to be open? What do the comedians bring to the table? Can they come talk to their political allies, their council people, their mayor, their county executive, and figure out who cares about this? I mean, that's really the first step, is who wants to champion this? Who cares about comedy enough to champion it? I don't know the answer to that question, but that's what I would do, is really like figure out who's interested in it, and then who has capacity and resources that they could possibly bring to this equation. It's not easily done, Zach.
And is there a place for like a role for government in that sort of project, or is that something that has to be done privately?
Well, I don't know who owns that actual real estate.
Sure.
Right? Government does occasionally acquire real estate. I am unaware of anyone acquiring real estate for a comedy club. Is it out of the question? I don't know that it's out of the question, but I don't know that it's been done before. Maybe in New York, maybe in Los Angeles, maybe there are places. Certainly, there are some comedy clubs that are held by a nonprofit, but I don't know of any held by government. It's a great question. I saw your podcast about the comedians trying to save the comedy club.
Yeah, I've only recently kind of gotten in touch with that scene, but it seems like the thing I see in common with like the open mics and those comedy scenes and like street performers, who I also have several friends who are like buskers, and there's something about just that accessibility that is like to me like a sign of a thriving city, you know.
Hmm.
And like if you go to a place and you have a lot of street performers, it feels like this is like a healthy neighborhood, you know. And so to some degree it feels like if I had my way, that'd be part of what the city would be helping to like reverse engineer, you know, is like let's get that stuff going on. It seems like the health of the city would rise with it, but that's just
Oh, I agree with you. The more street performers we have, the more accessible art we have. Definitely creates a thriving city. One thing that could potentially happen is knock on the doors of the Vera Project, of Columbia City Theater, of folks who already have space. Do they have any interest in a comedy scene and like building up some groundwork on a stage there that is currently accessible? And then, if there's a strong enough scene that someone can build a business model around it, then it holds more potential for the private sector.
awesome. And similarly, I was curious if you know of any, like, I'm really interested in, I guess, trying to create new paths for people to get into the art scene.
Nice.
Because it seems like, like a lot of industries, like having networks and having like people you know helps a lot, you know? But there's so many people who I think want to get a foot in the door and they just don't have the resources or the connections to do that. So, like, that's why the open mics appeal or like the places for buskers. Another thing is like art show, like homeless art shows. Like there was one being advertised here on Cap Hill a couple months ago, and I think it was just something that the homeless community themselves started postering up.
Oh,
And
wow.
it was like next week, next Saturday, come to this place. There's going to be a homeless art show, and I went that day and nobody was there. And
Oh.
it kind of made me, and all the posters in the meantime have been taken down. It was kind of this thing where it's like, oh, I was hoping to kind of see what would come of this. But it also made me think like the city should be like helping, like, I don't know, organize these types of things, like helping get those people who don't have access to get into a normal art show still like a way to maybe sell some art or like get noticed by somebody, you know?
Hmm.
So I was just curious if that sort of like street level stuff is part of your guys' conversation, or if it is more like, you know, the larger venue type uh, stuff that you focus on.
So it's an astute question you're asking. There are multiple divisions of government. So, for instance, in King County, my creative economy initiative is really focused more on helping people stay employed, helping people stay in business, very much work with the private sector, independent businesses. Our colleagues in For Culture, which is the King County funded arts and culture division, they focus far more on individual performers, where the opportunities are for access throughout the county. And similarly in the city, there's the Office of Economic Development and the Office of Film and Music, very much focused on jobs, 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 and business, small business. And then the Office of Arts and Culture is more focused on the artists themselves and where the opportunity is for all sorts of different cultural things like you're talking about to happen. And the Office of Arts and Culture also has a really great gallery at King Street Station that is indeed an accessible gallery for folks to pitch them on having a show there. And it's really designed to create space for historically marginalized populations to show their work.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I think you've touched on a lot of the stuff I was curious about, but I'd love to end with a kind of lighter question, which is just what are some of the Seattle local artists or pieces of art that you've seen over the years that have stuck out the most to you or really inspired you or that people should go check out?
Oh my goodness. So, I have had the great honor of producing many shows in my life. So, lots of musicians. I could speak endlessly about the musicians in Seattle from 20 years ago to some performers I saw on Saturday night who were just top notch. But we have such a dense city of art. Everything from the gallery I just mentioned, King Street Station Gallery, which always has a fantastic show on. We have the big Seattle Art Fair coming this weekend. And then, of course, we have the Seattle Art Museum. But there are lots of some of the coolest art happens in bars. It's on the walls of places like the Hideout or places where artists can actually show and sell their work. That is what I love the most. So, really, I hope that as we move forward in this city, we find a way to keep our artists having those opportunities so that we all can collect art, we all can see shows, we all can see independent film, and we have a way to do that that really is accessible to people. It's so important. Folks will not have a full or complete or, dare I say, happy life if they are not able to access art in our city. So we've got to find a way to keep it accessible. And that's part of what my work is. And thank you for having me on your show, Zach.
Thank you so much for taking the time out to talk with me. Is there anywhere where people can follow you, or if they just want to keep in touch with like what is going on with the Seattle creative world, like where can they follow, keep up to date?
Great. So kingcountycreative.com is the county's website. Washington Filmworks and bewhipsmart.org. WashingtonFilmworks.org. BeWhipSmart.org is a statewide organization of small businesses in the creative sector working together. Seattle Office of Arts and Culture has a whole lot going on. So their website, which is seattle.gov arts and culture, I think, but if you search for Seattle arts and culture, and then paying attention to, the things that come across social media, there's not so much print media anymore. We have very little arts journalism in this city, in this region right now. So tuning into those things, and then just ear to the ground, talking to people, to artists, what's going on, and making it a point to show up and support, because that's what it takes to have a healthy art scene, is that people are a part of it, that people come out when they're invited. So word of mouth is huge too.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much once
Thank
again.
you,
I
Zach.
really appreciate you taking the time.
Absolutely. This has been fun. Thank
Good.
you.
I'm glad.
Yeah.
Thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Maybe you learned something, maybe you didn't. Let me know in the comments. I love hearing from you guys. If you want to see more of these types of videos, hit the subscribe button. I'm going to be posting more interviews like this. Thank you to Kate for taking the time to talk to me, and I really hope to see King County continue to push for more opportunities for creative people. That's all for now. Thanks for watching. See you next time.